Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel created not just a philosophy, but an entire system for comprehending the deepest structures of existence itself. His ideas would inspire revolutionaries like Karl Marx, influence psychoanalysts like Jacques Lacan, and shape the thinking of countless philosophers, political theorists, and artists for centuries to come. But Hegel is also famously difficult to understand. His writing is dense, his concepts are abstract, and his system is vast and interconnected. Many people have heard fragments of his ideas, the master-slave dialectic, the notion of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or the concept of the absolute, but few grasp how these pieces fit together into a coherent vision of reality. Today we will change that by exploring every major aspect of his philosophical system in complete detail. Hegel's influence extends far beyond academic philosophy into Marx's conception of historical dialectic, Kierkegaard's existentialism, and even contemporary movements in critical theory and psychoanalysis. Understanding Hegel means understanding the intellectual foundations of the modern world. His ideas about consciousness, freedom, history, and the state continue to shape political movements, psychological theories, and cultural criticism today. This is not merely historical curiosity, but living philosophy that remains urgently relevant. Hegel was one of the first modern philosophers to stress that our ideas, especially those expressed in philosophies and sciences, are not just loosely connected, but rather they form an interconnected system, each member of which is implicated in, or required by, the others. His central insight was that truth cannot be found in isolated propositions, but only in complete systems of thought. The proposition treated by Hegel as central to his philosophy is truth is the totality. We will journey through his complete system, from the most abstract logical categories to the concrete realities of art, religion, and political life. We will see how consciousness develops from simple sense awareness to absolute knowledge, how individuals achieve freedom through social institutions, and how history itself moves toward greater rationality and self-understanding. This is the story of how mind and reality, subject and object, individual and universal, come to recognize themselves as fundamentally one. Part 1. The Revolutionary Method. The heart of Hegel's entire philosophical system lies in his revolutionary approach to thinking itself. Most people have heard of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but this formula actually came from Johann Fichte, not Hegel. Hegel argued that such language was a lifeless schema imposed on various contents, whereas he saw his own dialectic as flowing out of the inner life and self-movement of the content itself. Understanding what Hegel actually meant by dialectics is crucial to grasping everything else in his philosophy. Traditional logic, the kind taught in schools, treats contradictions as fatal errors. If something is both A and not A at the same time, classical logic declares this impossible and abandons the inquiry. Hegel saw this as a fundamental mistake that keeps us from understanding reality as it actually is. For him, contradictions are not obstacles to thought, but the very engine that drives both thinking and reality forward. The Hegelian dialectic describes changes in the forms of thought through their own internal contradictions into concrete forms that overcome previous oppositions. Think of a seed planted in soil. The seed must negate itself, must cease being a mere seed in order to become a plant. But this negation is not simple destruction. The plant contains and preserves the essence of the seed while also transcending it. This is what Hegel calls Aufhebung, often translated as sublation, a process that simultaneously cancels, preserves, and elevates. But Hegel goes much further than biological metaphors. He argues that every concept, every idea, every aspect of reality contains within itself its own opposition. Take the concept of being, the most abstract idea we can think. Pure being, being with no qualities or characteristics whatsoever, turns out to be indistinguishable from pure nothing. Being is the positive moment, nothing is the negative moment, and becoming is the moment of synthesis that cancels and preserves or unifies and combines being and nothing. Through this contradiction, we arrive at the richer concept of becoming, which captures both being and non-being in dynamic motion. This is not just abstract philosophical wordplay. Hegel sees this same pattern everywhere in human experience. Consider the development of freedom in society. Ancient empires represented centralized power as thesis, which eventually faced opposition from the rise of individual liberties and democratic principles as antithesis. The synthesis of these opposing forces is the modern state, which aims to balance centralized authority with individual rights and freedoms. Neither pure autocracy nor pure anarchy can sustain itself. Only through working through this contradiction do we achieve a higher form of political organization. Or consider technological development in our contemporary world. The rapid advancement of technology as thesis has transformed our lives but also created challenges like privacy concerns and job displacement as antithesis. The ongoing synthesis involves finding ways to harness technology for social good while addressing its drawbacks. We cannot simply embrace or reject technology wholesale. Progress comes through wrestling with these contradictions and finding higher unities that preserve the benefits while overcoming the limitations. What makes Hegel's dialectical method truly revolutionary is that it shows contradictions to be productive rather than destructive. Because the determinations sublate themselves, Hegel's dialectics does not require some new idea to show up arbitrarily, but the movement to new determinations is driven by the nature of the earlier determinations. This gives his philosophy a sense of logical necessity that he believed elevated it above mere opinion or arbitrary speculation. Unlike in Plato's arbitrary dialectics, in Hegel's dialectics, nothing extraneous is introduced, as the dialectics is driven by the nature, immanence, or inwardness of its own content. Each stage necessarily generates its own opposition and resolution. This creates what Hegel calls a self-moving concept, a form of thinking that develops according to its own inner logic rather than being imposed from outside. The philosopher's job is not to invent clever arguments, but to follow where the concepts themselves lead. This method also explains why Hegel's philosophy forms a complete system rather than a collection of separate doctrines. Each concept in his system plays a role and makes a contribution to the operation of the whole philosophy, just as each organ in the body contributes to the organism's life. You cannot simply extract one Hegelian idea and ignore the rest. When Einstein challenged Newtonian concepts of space and time, every other concept in physics had to be reconsidered as well. Similarly, each element of Hegel's system implies and requires every other element. The dialectical method reveals why Hegel rejected the common sense view that truth consists in correspondence between ideas and external objects. If reality itself develops dialectically, through contradictions and their resolution, then our thinking must follow the same pattern to grasp truth adequately. Truth is, the totality means that we must understand how all the parts fit together, not just collect isolated facts. Reality is not a collection of separate things, but a dynamic, self-developing whole in which everything is connected to everything else. Part 2. The Journey of Consciousness. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit tells the story of how human consciousness develops from its most primitive forms to complete self-awareness. This is not a psychological account of how individual minds grow, but a logical exploration of the necessary stages that consciousness must pass through to achieve genuine knowledge. The phenomenology serves as the introduction to Hegel's entire philosophical system, showing how we can legitimately claim to know anything at all about reality. It is simultaneously the most brilliant and most difficult of all his works. The journey begins with what Hegel calls sense certainty, our immediate awareness of things through the senses. Common sense tells us that this direct sensory contact with objects gives us the most reliable knowledge possible. We point to something and say this here now, believing we have grasped pure, factual truth. But Hegel shows that even this apparently simple awareness involves complex universal concepts. The words here now and this are universals that apply to countless different situations. What we thought was pure particularity turns out to depend on universality. As consciousness tries to hold on to pure sensory immediacy, it discovers that immediate knowledge is actually mediated knowledge. The here becomes a complex spatial framework, the now becomes a temporal structure, and the this becomes a conceptual determination. Consciousness realizes it cannot separate the sensory given from the conceptual apparatus it uses to interpret that given. This forces consciousness to move to the next stage, perception, where it explicitly acknowledges both the thing perceived and the properties it possesses. But perception also generates its own contradictions. Consciousness tries to understand objects as unities of multiple properties, but struggles with how one thing can be both one and many simultaneously. A piece of salt is simultaneously white, cubic, sharp-tasting, and dissolving. How can one substance possess all these different characteristics without falling apart into separate elements? Consciousness finds itself attributing the unity to the object and the multiplicity to its own perceiving activity, then reversing this attribution when problems arise. This oscillation reveals that consciousness cannot maintain a clear separation between subjective contributions and objective features. The failure of perception drives consciousness toward understanding, where it seeks to grasp the inner essence or force that underlies surface appearances. Consciousness now recognizes that truth lies not in immediate sensory contact or perceived properties, but in the underlying laws and forces that govern phenomenal manifestations. Scientific understanding exemplifies this stage where we explain visible effects through invisible causes like gravitational fields or electromagnetic forces. But understanding also faces a crucial limitation. It treats the laws and forces it discovers as objective structures existing independently of consciousness, never recognizing its own activity in constructing these explanatory frameworks. The transition to self-consciousness marks a decisive turning point in the phenomenological journey. Consciousness finally recognizes that it has been present all along in every stage of its development. The objects it thought it was simply discovering were actually objects for consciousness, shaped by consciousness's own conceptual activity. This recognition transforms consciousness into self-consciousness, awareness that is explicitly aware of itself as the subject of its own knowing process. But self-consciousness immediately faces a new problem. If everything it knows is shaped by its own activity, how can it distinguish between genuine knowledge and mere subjective projection? Self-consciousness seeks certainty about its own nature and reality, but finds that it cannot achieve this certainty in isolation. The self cannot validate itself through pure introspection, because it has no external standard against which to measure its claims. This limitation drives self-consciousness beyond itself toward encounters with other self-conscious beings. The movement from individual self-consciousness to social recognition represents one of Hegel's most profound insights. Genuine self-knowledge requires acknowledgement from others who are themselves capable of self-knowledge. I cannot simply declare myself to be rational, free, or worthy of respect. These claims must be recognized by other rational agents who are capable of making similar claims about themselves. Self-consciousness is essentially intersubjective, achieved through mutual recognition rather than solitary reflection. This intersubjective requirement explains why the phenomenological journey cannot remain at the level of individual consciousness, but must move through increasingly complex forms of social and cultural life. Consciousness develops through participation in shared practices, institutions, and forms of life that embody different approaches to the problem of achieving mutual recognition. The later chapters of the Phenomenology trace this development through ancient Greek ethical life, Roman legal consciousness, medieval Christianity, Enlightenment rationality, and German idealist philosophy. Each cultural formation represents a different attempt to solve the problem of how finite individuals can achieve genuine knowledge and authentic selfhood. The phenomenological journey reveals that consciousness and its objects develop together through a single dialectical process. Consciousness does not simply discover pre-existing objects, but participates in the constitution of objectivity itself. Similarly, objects are not simply given, but are always objects for consciousness, shaped by the conceptual frameworks through which consciousness encounters them. This insight undermines the traditional philosophical assumption that knowledge involves a relationship between two independently existing terms, a knowing subject and a known object. Instead, Hegel shows that subjectivity and objectivity are moments within a more fundamental unity that he calls absolute knowledge. Part 3. The Life and Death Struggle. The most famous and influential section of Hegel's phenomenology describes the life and death struggle between two self-consciousnesses that encounter each other in what appears to be a state of nature. This dramatic narrative has inspired revolutionary movements, psychoanalytic theories, and post-colonial critiques, but its philosophical significance goes far deeper than any particular political application. The master-slave dialectic reveals the fundamental structure of recognition that underlies all genuine human relationships. It shows why freedom and self-consciousness cannot be achieved in isolation, but require ongoing interaction with others who are equally free and self-conscious. Two self-consciousnesses meet in the wild, each having previously considered itself the measure of all things. Before this encounter, each consciousness treated its own desires and judgments as objectively valid standards. But now each faces another consciousness making similar claims to universal validity. This creates an immediate conflict because both cannot be the single objective standard. Each must either subordinate itself to the other or force the other to acknowledge its superior claim. The result is a struggle to the death in which each consciousness risks its life to prove that it values recognition more than mere biological existence. But if the struggle ends in death, recognition becomes impossible. A dead consciousness cannot acknowledge the superiority of its victor. The struggle must stop short of actual death, with one consciousness choosing to submit rather than die. This creates the master-slave relationship, where one consciousness gains recognition as master, while the other accepts the position of slave or bondsman. The master has proven that freedom matters more than life, while the slave has revealed that life matters more than freedom. This seems to give the master everything he sought: dominance, recognition and freedom from material concerns. However, the master's victory is Pyrrhic because it undermines the very recognition he sought to achieve. Recognition is only valuable when it comes from someone who is free to give or withhold it. A slave who is forced to acknowledge the master's superiority provides no genuine validation of the master's worth. The master receives only the empty form of recognition without its substance. Moreover, the master becomes increasingly dependent on the slave for all his material needs, gradually losing the very independence that originally defined his mastery. The master becomes enslaved to his own mastery. The slave's situation appears hopeless, but it contains hidden advantages that eventually transform the entire relationship. First, the slave retains fear of death, which keeps him in contact with the fundamental finitude of human existence. The master, having proven his superiority to death, loses touch with this essential aspect of the human condition. Second, the slave must work to satisfy the master's desires, which requires him to develop skills, knowledge, and disciplined control over his impulses. Third, the slave encounters resistance from the material world, learning to shape recalcitrant nature according to human purposes. Through labor, the slave develops genuine competence and self-discipline. Most importantly, the slave sees himself reflected in the products of his work. The objects he creates bear the marks of his intelligence, skill, and purposive activity. This provides a form of objective self-recognition that is independent of the master's acknowledgement. The slave discovers that he has literally created the world that surrounds him, transforming raw nature into a human environment. This recognition of himself in his products gives the slave a form of self-consciousness that is more substantial than the master's abstract domination. The slave achieves genuine independence through his dependence on material reality. The dialectical reversal becomes complete when the slave realizes that the master's power depends entirely on the slave's continued willingness to work and obey. The master has no real skills, no practical knowledge, and no direct relationship with the material conditions of life. The slave's growing competence and self-awareness eventually make the master's domination unsustainable. True mastery belongs to the one who has mastered himself through disciplined engagement with reality, not to the one who merely dominates others. But Hegel's analysis does not stop with this simple reversal. The master-slave relationship is inherently unstable because it provides adequate recognition for neither party. The master receives empty recognition from someone he regards as inferior, while the slave's growing self-consciousness makes subordination increasingly intolerable. Both parties eventually recognize that genuine freedom requires forms of mutual recognition that transcend domination and subordination. This realization drives consciousness beyond the master-slave relationship toward more adequate forms of social and political life. The master-slave dialectic reveals several crucial insights about human nature. First, self-consciousness and freedom are not natural endowments, but achievements that must be won through struggle and sustained through ongoing effort. Second, recognition cannot be extracted by force, but must be freely given by others who are capable of meaningful acknowledgement. Third, genuine independence requires interdependence, engagement with others and with the material world rather than abstract self-assertion. Fourth, work and discipline are not merely economic necessities, but essential elements in the development of human freedom and self-consciousness. These insights continue to influence political theory, psychology, and social criticism today. Part 4. The Architecture of Absolute. At the summit of Hegel's philosophical system stands the concept that gives unity and meaning to everything else, the Absolute. This is not a mysterious supernatural entity, but the complete, self-contained totality of everything that exists, thought and being, subject and object, finite and infinite, all understood as moments within a single self-differentiating whole. The Absolute is reality as it truly is, when grasped by thought that has overcome all one-sided perspectives and achieved complete systematic comprehension. Understanding the Absolute requires seeing how Hegel's entire philosophical system fits together as an organic unity. The Absolute cannot be approached directly because finite understanding always grasps reality from particular limited perspectives. We see things as either subjective or objective, mental or physical, universal or particular, but never succeed in grasping how these oppositions belong together within a more fundamental unity. Ordinary consciousness treats these distinctions as fixed and final, creating the illusion that reality consists of separate, independently existing realms. The Absolute can only be approached through a systematic process that shows how each finite perspective generates its own opposition and finds completion in a higher synthesis. Hegel's system begins with the most abstract possible starting point, pure being without any determinate characteristics whatsoever. This seems like the most indubitable foundation for philosophy because it makes no specific claims that could be disputed. But pure being turns out to be indistinguishable from pure nothing, since both are completely without content or determination. This contradiction forces thought to move to the concept of becoming, which unifies being and nothing as moments within a dynamic process. From this simple beginning, Hegel derives increasingly complex and concrete logical categories through purely conceptual development. Each category contains contradictions that drive thought forward to more adequate determinations. The science of logic traces this development through three main stages. The logic of being deals with immediate determinations that appear to exist independently of thought. Categories like quality, quantity, and measure belong to this level, where thought encounters apparently objective structures in reality. The logic of essence examines the relationships and dependencies that connect these immediate determinations. Here we find categories like identity and difference, cause and effect, substance and accident, which reveal that nothing exists in complete independence. The logic of the concept shows how these relationships are actually expressions of conceptual activity, systematic patterns of thought that constitute the inner structure of reality itself. But logic alone cannot exhaust the content of the Absolute. Pure conceptual development reaches a point where it must externalize itself, become other than itself in order to achieve complete self-determination. This is the transition from logic to nature, where logical categories appear in the form of spatial, temporal, and material existence. Nature is the idea in the form of otherness, logic externalized and made concrete in physical reality. The philosophy of nature traces the development of increasingly complex natural forms, from pure space and time through mechanical, chemical and biological processes. Each stage represents a higher level of organization and self-determination within the natural realm. The development of nature reaches its culmination in living beings that are capable of self-maintenance, reproduction, and adaptation to their environment. But even the highest forms of natural life remain trapped within the cycle of immediate need, satisfaction, and biological repetition. The transition beyond nature occurs when life develops the capacity for genuine self-consciousness, awareness that can take itself as its own object. This is the emergence of spirit, the realm of human consciousness, culture, and freedom. Spirit represents the return of the idea to itself, enriched by its journey through natural externality, but now explicitly aware of itself as the source of all reality. The philosophy of spirit traces the development of consciousness from its simplest forms to its highest achievements. Subjective spirit examines individual consciousness, from basic sensation through self-consciousness to theoretical and practical reason. Objective spirit studies the social and political institutions through which individuals achieve mutual recognition and collective freedom. Absolute spirit explores the highest forms of human self-understanding through art, religion, and philosophy itself. Each level represents a more adequate form of the absolute self-knowledge and self-realization. The systematic character of Hegel's philosophy means that each part gains its full meaning only in relation to the whole. Logic, nature, and spirit are not three separate subjects, but three aspects of a single self-developing reality. The logical categories provide the inner structure that governs natural processes and spiritual development. Natural forms provide the external manifestation through which logic realizes itself concretely. Spiritual activities provide the explicit self-consciousness through which the Absolute comes to know itself as both logical and natural. The system is genuinely circular, with each part presupposing and completing every other part. This circularity reveals why Hegel's absolute is not a static, finished entity, but an ongoing process of self-development and self-recognition. The absolute is subject as well as substance, activity as well as result, process as well as product. It achieves completion not by reaching some final resting point, but by coming to understand its own infinite capacity for self-differentiation and self-recovery. The Absolute is the eternal process of going out from itself and returning to itself, enriched by each cycle of externalization and internalization. This makes Hegel's system genuinely dynamic rather than merely architectural. Part 5. The Logic of Pure Thought. Hegel's science of logic represents one of the most ambitious and systematic attempts in the history of philosophy to derive the fundamental categories of thought and reality from purely conceptual development. This massive work aims to show that the basic structures of reasoning, the categories we use to think about anything at all, form a self-developing system that generates its own content through internal necessity. The logic is not a study of how we happen to think, but an exploration of how thought must develop if it is to achieve genuine comprehension of reality. It provides the foundation for Hegel's entire philosophical system and remains one of his most challenging and controversial works. The logic begins with the most abstract possible concept, pure being, precisely because it seems to offer the most presuppositionless starting point for philosophical thinking. If we want to avoid arbitrary assumptions and achieve genuine systematic knowledge, we must begin with something that makes no particular claims about what exists or how it exists. Pure being, being as such without any specific characteristics or determinations, appears to meet this requirement. But this apparent advantage immediately reveals itself as a fatal weakness. Pure being, precisely because it has no determinate content, turns out to be indistinguishable from pure nothing. If we strip away everything that makes something the particular being it is, we are left with empty abstraction that has no content whatsoever. This identity of pure being and pure nothing creates the first dialectical movement in the logic. Being passes over into nothing, and nothing passes over into being, because each is the complete absence of determination. But this mutual transition is itself a determinate process, the process of becoming. Becoming unifies being and nothing as moments within a dynamic movement that contains both emergence and disappearance. Something becomes by emerging from nothing, but it also becomes nothing by passing away. Becoming is thus the first concrete category in the logic, richer than either pure being or pure nothing, because it contains both as sublated moments. But becoming itself proves to be unstable and generates its own dialectical development. The process of becoming must result in something determinate, some definite being that has emerged from the flux of becoming. This leads to the category of determinate being or existence, being that has specific qualities and characteristics. Determinate being is no longer the pure abstraction with which the logic began, but concrete, qualitatively specific reality. However, determinate being faces its own contradictions because anything with specific qualities is limited by what it excludes. To be something definite is also to be not something else, which introduces negation into the heart of positive existence. The logic of being continues through increasingly complex categories like quality, quantity, and measure, each generated by the contradictions inherent in the previous category. Quality deals with the immediate intrinsic characteristics that make something the specific thing it is. But qualitative determination proves to be unstable because qualities can change without destroying the identity of the thing that possesses them. This leads to quantity, where differences become matters of degree rather than kind. Quantitative determination seems more stable than qualitative because numerical relationships appear to be objective and precise. But quantity without quality is empty abstraction, while quality without quantity lacks determinacy. Their unity is achieved in measure, where quantitative relationships become qualitatively significant. The transition from the logic of being to the logic of essence marks a major shift in the development of logical categories. The categories of being treat their objects as immediate, independently existing entities, but this approach breaks down when it becomes clear that nothing exists in complete independence. Essence is the sphere of relationality, where everything is understood as what it is only in relation to something else. Categories like identity and difference, similarity and contrast, cause and effect, substance and accident all belong to this level. Each reveals that apparently independent beings are actually moments within larger networks of relationship and dependency. Essence is being reflected into itself, being that has overcome immediate givenness and exists only through its relationships. The logic of essence culminates in the recognition that all these relationships are actually expressions of conceptual activity. Cause and effect, substance and accident, identity and difference are not objective structures that thought simply discovers in reality. They are patterns of conceptual determination through which thought constitutes objectivity itself. This recognition leads to the third and final division of the logic of the concept, where thought explicitly recognizes itself as the source of all the categories it has been developing. The logic of the concept deals with thought's relationship to itself rather than its relationship to apparently external objects. Here we find categories like universality, particularity, and individuality, which describe the internal structure of conceptual activity itself. The universal concept determines itself through particular applications and achieves concrete reality in individual instances. But the individual is not simply a particular case of a universal rule. In genuine conceptual thinking, the individual contains and expresses the universal, while the universal realizes itself through individual determination. This creates what Hegel calls the self-determining concept, thought that develops its own content through its own activity. The logic concludes with what Hegel calls the absolute idea, the complete self-contained system of all logical categories understood as expressions of pure conceptual activity. The absolute idea is not a super-concept that somehow contains all other concepts as parts. It is the systematic whole of conceptual development, the process through which thought achieves complete self-knowledge by developing all the categories necessary for comprehensive understanding. But this logical completion is also a new beginning, because the absolute idea must externalize itself to achieve concrete reality. This externalization is the transition from logic to nature, where the logical categories appear in spatial, temporal, and material form. The logic thus provides the rational foundation for understanding both natural processes and spiritual development. Part 6. Nature as Idea in Otherness. Hegel's philosophy of nature represents his systematic attempt to understand the natural world as the external manifestation of logical relationships. Nature is not a separate realm that exists independently of thought, but the idea in the form of otherness, the logical structure of reality externalized in space, time, and material existence. This does not mean that Hegel reduces nature to mere thought or denies the reality of physical processes. Rather, he argues that natural phenomena embody rational patterns that can be comprehended through philosophical analysis of their underlying conceptual structure. The philosophy of nature shows how the categories developed in the logic manifest themselves in the concrete forms of natural existence. The externalization of the idea in nature creates fundamentally different conditions from those found in pure logical development. While logical categories develop through purely conceptual necessity, natural forms are characterized by contingency, external relation, and what Hegel calls the impotence of nature. Natural processes cannot maintain the perfect systematic coherence found in logical thinking because they exist in space and time, which introduce elements of arbitrariness and external determination. A logical category contains its own development within itself, but a natural entity depends on external conditions and influences that cannot be predicted from conceptual analysis alone. Despite this contingency, nature is not simply chaotic or irrational. The philosophy of nature traces a development from the most abstract natural forms to increasingly complex and self-determining organizations. This development follows the same basic pattern found in the logic, moving from immediate existence through relational determination to self-related individuality. But this logical pattern appears in nature as a temporal sequence of emerging forms rather than a purely conceptual derivation. Each level of natural organization exhibits higher degrees of unity, self-maintenance, and independence from external determination. The first major division of the philosophy of nature deals with mechanics, the realm of space, time, matter, and motion. Here we find the most abstract natural forms, where logical relationships appear in purely external manifestation. Space and time provide the universal medium within which all natural existence occurs, but they have no content of their own beyond pure externality. Matter fills space and persists through time, giving concrete reality to spatial and temporal relationships. Motion represents the first form of natural self-determination, where matter transcends simple location by relating itself to different spatial positions. But mechanical motion remains entirely external, determined by forces and laws that operate independently of the material entities they govern. The second division, physics, examines natural forms that exhibit greater internal organization and self-determination. Physical processes like magnetism, electricity, and chemical reaction involve entities that maintain their identity through internal differentiation and external relation. A magnet is not simply a piece of matter occupying space, but a self-organizing system that creates its own field of influence and maintains polarity through interaction with other magnetic entities. Chemical elements achieve even higher levels of self-determination by maintaining specific properties through participation in various compounds and reactions. These physical forms begin to exhibit something approaching conceptual behavior, where the universal nature of the entity determines its particular manifestations and individual existence. The third and highest division of the philosophy of nature deals with organic life, where natural entities achieve genuine individuality and self-determination. Living beings maintain themselves through their own activity, actively relating to their environment rather than being passively determined by external forces. A plant or animal is not simply a complex physical system, but a self-organizing whole that preserves its identity through constant change and development. Organic individuality represents the highest achievement possible within the natural realm, genuine self-relatedness that maintains itself through external relationship. But even the highest forms of organic life remain limited by the conditions of natural existence. Living beings achieve self-maintenance and reproduction, but they cannot transcend the cycle of immediate need satisfaction and biological repetition. They respond to their environment but cannot transform it according to rational purposes. They reproduce their species but cannot create genuinely new forms of existence. Most importantly, they cannot take themselves as objects of their own awareness or recognize themselves in their own products. These limitations point beyond nature toward the realm of spirit, where the idea returns to itself in the form of self-conscious freedom. Hegel's treatment of organic life leads directly to his account of death as the natural fate of all finite living beings. Death is not simply the cessation of biological functions, but the dialectical limit that reveals both the achievement and the limitation of natural individuality. The living individual achieves genuine unity and self-relation, but this achievement cannot be sustained indefinitely under natural conditions. Death reveals that finite individuality points beyond itself toward forms of selfhood that can transcend natural limitation. This creates the transition from the philosophy of nature to the philosophy of spirit, where the idea achieves self-consciousness and genuine infinity through human freedom and cultural development. The philosophy of nature serves several crucial functions within Hegel's systematic philosophy. First, it shows how logical categories achieve concrete reality without losing their rational character. Second, it demonstrates that natural processes follow comprehensible patterns despite their apparent contingency and external determination. Third, it provides the foundation for understanding human beings as natural entities who are nonetheless capable of transcending natural limitation through reason and freedom. Fourth, it reveals why spirit cannot be reduced to nature, even though it necessarily emerges from natural development. The philosophy of nature thus bridges the gap between abstract logical thinking and concrete spiritual existence. Part 7. The Realm of Human Spirit. The philosophy of spirit represents the culmination of Hegel's systematic philosophy, where the idea returns to itself in the form of self-conscious freedom and achieves complete self-knowledge through human cultural development. Spirit is not some mysterious supernatural entity, but the realm of human consciousness, society and culture understood as the highest manifestation of rational reality. In spirit, the logical categories that were merely external in nature become explicitly self-conscious and freely self-determining. Human beings are natural entities who have transcended natural limitation by becoming aware of themselves as thinking, choosing, and creating subjects. The philosophy of spirit traces the development of this self-consciousness from its simplest forms to its highest achievements in art, religion, and philosophy. The development of spirit follows the same triadic pattern found throughout Hegel's system, moving from immediate existence through external relationship to self-related infinity. Subjective spirit deals with individual consciousness and its internal development from sensation to theoretical and practical reason. Objective spirit examines the social and political institutions through which individuals achieve mutual recognition and collective freedom. Absolute spirit explores the highest forms of cultural achievement where humanity comes to understand itself and its place in the ultimate structure of reality. Each level represents a more adequate realization of human freedom and self-determination. Subjective spirit begins with the most elementary forms of consciousness, starting with the soul's immediate immersion in natural existence. The human soul initially exists in direct unity with its bodily and environmental conditions, much like animal consciousness, but with the crucial difference that it contains the potential for self-awareness. This potential actualizes itself through a complex process of differentiation and self-recognition. Consciousness proper emerges when the soul becomes explicitly aware of the distinction between itself and its objects, but this awareness initially takes the form of external relationship rather than genuine self-knowledge. The development of consciousness passes through the stages described in the phenomenology of spirit, from sense certainty through perception and understanding to self-consciousness. But the account in the philosophy of spirit is more systematic and less historical than the phenomenological narrative. Here, Hegel focuses on the logical structure of consciousness rather than its experiential development. Consciousness achieves theoretical reason when it recognizes its own conceptual activity in the objects it knows, understanding that objectivity itself is constituted through subjective thinking. It achieves practical reason when it recognizes its power to transform reality according to rational purposes, making the external world conform to conscious intentions. But subjective spirit remains incomplete as long as it exists in isolation from other conscious beings. Individual consciousness can achieve theoretical and practical mastery, but it cannot validate its own claims to rationality and freedom without recognition from others who are equally rational and free. This limitation drives subjective spirit beyond itself toward the realm of objective spirit, where individuals create shared institutions that embody their common commitment to rational freedom. Objective spirit is not simply the collection of individual consciousnesses, but the realm of social reality that exists through individual participation while transcending any particular individual. Objective spirit develops through three main stages that correspond to increasingly adequate forms of mutual recognition and collective freedom. Abstract right deals with the minimal conditions for social coexistence, the basic legal framework that allows individuals to interact without destroying each other's freedom. Property rights, contracts, and criminal law provide the foundation for social life, but remain external constraints rather than expressions of genuine ethical commitment. Morality represents the attempt to ground social relationships in individual moral conviction rather than external legal compulsion. But purely individual morality proves inadequate because it lacks objective content and provides no reliable basis for social cooperation. These limitations drive objective spirit toward ethical life, where individual moral conviction and social institutional reality achieve genuine unity. Ethical life realizes itself through three basic institutions that provide the framework for complete human flourishing. The family represents the sphere of immediate ethical unity based on love and natural affection. Here individuals find recognition and support without the need for explicit moral reflection or legal enforcement. But family relationships remain limited to particular connections and cannot provide the universal framework needed for complex social cooperation. Civil society emerges when individuals pursue their particular interests through market relationships and voluntary associations. This creates a realm of freedom and diversity, but also generates conflicts and inequalities that cannot be resolved through purely private interactions. The state represents the culmination of objective spirit, where particular interests and universal rational principles achieve systematic unity. Hegel's state is not simply a mechanism for enforcing law or protecting individual rights, but the institutional embodiment of a community's commitment to rational freedom. A genuine state enables individuals to achieve both particular satisfaction and universal recognition by participating in institutions that express their shared rational nature. The state includes not only governmental structures, but all the institutions through which a community organizes its collective life: educational systems, professional associations, cultural organizations, and religious communities. These institutions provide the framework within which individuals can develop their capacities and achieve genuine self-realization through contribution to the common good. But even the most rational state remains limited by its historical particularity and cannot provide the ultimate framework for human self-understanding. This limitation points beyond objective spirit toward absolute spirit, where humanity transcends all finite limitations and achieves complete self-knowledge through art, religion, and philosophy. Absolute spirit represents spirit's relationship to itself, rather than its relationship to external nature or finite social institutions. Here humanity comes to understand its own essential nature and its place within the ultimate structure of reality itself. Part 8. The Science of Freedom. Hegel's political philosophy, developed primarily in his Elements of the Philosophy of Right, represents one of the most systematic and influential attempts to understand the state as the highest embodiment of human freedom and rational self-determination. Unlike liberal theories that view the state as a necessary evil that constrains individual liberty, Hegel argues that genuine freedom can only be achieved through participation in rational political institutions. The state is not external to individual freedom, but the very condition that makes authentic freedom possible. This provocative thesis requires understanding what Hegel means by freedom and why he believes it necessitates political organization rather than individual autonomy. Hegel begins his political philosophy by rejecting the common identification of freedom with the absence of external constraint. Negative freedom, the mere ability to do whatever one wants without interference, is actually a form of bondage to arbitrary desire and external circumstance. A person who acts purely on impulse or immediate inclination is not free, but enslaved to forces beyond their rational control. Genuine freedom requires the ability to determine one's actions according to rational principles, rather than immediate impulse. This positive freedom involves self-discipline, the capacity to act on reasons rather than desires, and the development of rational purposes that transcend immediate self-interest. But such rational self-determination cannot be achieved in isolation from social and political relationships. The philosophy of right traces the development of freedom through three major stages that correspond to increasingly adequate forms of self-determination. Abstract right establishes the minimal conditions for freedom by recognizing individuals as persons capable of owning property and entering into contracts. Property rights provide the foundation for freedom by giving individuals exclusive control over external objects that they can use to realize their purposes. Contracts create the possibility for voluntary cooperation between independent persons who can coordinate their activities without sacrificing their autonomy. But abstract right remains formal and external, providing the legal framework for freedom without ensuring that individuals will actually use their rights to achieve rational self-determination. The sphere of right can protect freedom but cannot create it. Morality represents the attempt to ground freedom in individual moral conviction rather than external legal compulsion. The moral point of view recognizes that genuine freedom requires acting from duty rather than inclination, following universal principles rather than particular desires. Kant's categorical imperative exemplifies this approach by demanding that individuals act only on principles they could will to be universal laws. But Hegel argues that purely formal moral principles lack determinate content and cannot provide reliable guidance for concrete action. The categorical imperative tells us to avoid contradiction but does not specify what purposes we should pursue or how we should organize social life. Moreover, individual moral conviction remains subjective and provides no guarantee that different people's moral judgments will converge on common principles. These limitations drive the development of freedom beyond abstract right and individual morality toward ethical life, where rational principles become embodied in concrete social institutions. Ethical life represents the unity of individual moral conviction and objective social reality, where people find their freedom realized through participation in shared practices and institutions. Unlike abstract right, ethical life provides substantive content for freedom by specifying the roles, relationships, and responsibilities through which individuals can achieve self-realization. Unlike individual morality, ethical life provides objective validation for moral principles by embedding them in stable social institutions. Ethical life develops through three basic institutions that provide increasingly comprehensive frameworks for human flourishing. The family represents immediate ethical unity based on love, trust, and mutual care. Family relationships are not merely biological or legal arrangements, but ethical bonds that create genuine community between individuals who recognize their essential interdependence. Parents and children, husbands and wives achieve self-realization through devotion to the family as a whole rather than pursuit of purely individual goals. But family relationships remain limited to particular connections and cannot provide the universal framework needed for complex modern social life. The family provides the foundation for ethical development, but cannot encompass all the relationships and activities through which modern individuals achieve self-realization. Civil society emerges when individuals leave the family sphere and pursue their particular interests through market relationships, professional associations, and voluntary organizations. This creates unprecedented opportunities for individual development and social cooperation, allowing people with diverse talents and interests to coordinate their activities through complex networks of exchange and communication. But civil society also generates new forms of conflict and inequality that threaten to undermine the ethical foundations of social life. Market competition can lead to exploitation and social fragmentation, while the pursuit of private interest can erode commitment to the common good. Civil society thus requires external regulation and ethical guidance to prevent it from destroying the conditions for its own existence. The state represents the highest achievement of ethical life, where particular interests and universal principles achieve systematic unity through rational political institutions. Hegel's state is not simply a mechanism for enforcing law or protecting individual rights, but the institutional embodiment of a community's commitment to rational freedom. A genuine state enables citizens to achieve both particular satisfaction and universal recognition by participating in institutions that express their shared rational nature. The state includes constitutional structures that ensure political participation, educational systems that develop rational capacities, economic policies that promote general welfare, and cultural institutions that foster ethical development. Through participation in these institutions, citizens realize their freedom not despite political obligation, but precisely through it. Political participation becomes a form of self-realization rather than self-sacrifice. Part 9. The Cunning of Reason. Hegel's philosophy of history represents his most ambitious attempt to discover rational patterns in the seemingly chaotic succession of historical events. Unlike traditional approaches that treat history as either meaningless contingency or divine providence operating beyond human understanding, Hegel argues that history exhibits a comprehensible logical development that can be grasped through philosophical analysis. History is the realm in which human freedom progressively realizes itself through the creation of increasingly rational forms of social and political life. This development occurs not through the conscious planning of individuals, but through what Hegel calls the cunning of reason, the way rational outcomes emerge from the collision of particular interests and passions. The motor of historical development is the fundamental human need for recognition, the drive to have one's freedom and dignity acknowledged by others who are equally free and capable of meaningful recognition. This need creates inevitable conflicts because different groups hold incompatible ideas about what deserves recognition and how recognition should be structured. These conflicts generate historical change as societies develop new institutions and practices in response to the contradictions and limitations of existing arrangements. Historical development thus follows the same dialectical pattern found throughout Hegel's system, where contradictions lead to higher syntheses that preserve valuable elements while overcoming previous limitations. Hegel divides world history into 4 major epochs that represent successive stages in the development of human freedom and self-consciousness. The Oriental world represents the childhood of humanity, where freedom exists only in the form of one individual, the despot, while all others remain in natural subjection. Oriental despotism achieves political unity and cultural sophistication, but cannot recognize the principle of individual freedom that is essential for genuine human development. The Persian Empire begins to transcend this limitation by incorporating diverse peoples and cultures, but still maintains the basic structure of despotic rule. The Greek world represents the youth of humanity, where the principle of individual freedom emerges but remains limited to particular communities and cannot achieve universal recognition. Greek city-states create unprecedented opportunities for political participation and cultural achievement, but exclude large portions of the population from citizenship and depend on slavery for economic production. Greek freedom is beautiful and immediate, but lacks the universal principles needed for inclusive political organization. The Greek ideal of harmony between individual and community proves unsustainable when confronted with the diversity and complexity of larger political units. The Roman world represents the manhood of humanity, where legal and political institutions achieve universal scope, but at the cost of genuine ethical community. Roman law creates the first truly universal framework for political organization, recognizing all free individuals as legal persons regardless of their particular cultural background. But Roman universality remains abstract and formal, providing legal equality without substantive freedom or genuine community. The Roman Empire achieves political unity through military conquest and administrative efficiency, but cannot create the ethical bonds that make political participation a form of self-realization, rather than external compulsion. The Germanic world represents the old age or maturity of humanity, where the principle of infinite subjectivity introduced by Christianity achieves political realization through constitutional monarchy and modern ethical life. Christianity revolutionizes human self-understanding by recognizing the infinite worth of every individual soul and the possibility of reconciliation between finite and infinite, human and divine. But the full political implications of this religious insight require centuries of development to achieve institutional realization. The Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution represent crucial stages in this development, each contributing to the recognition of universal human freedom and dignity. The French Revolution exemplifies both the achievement and the limitation of the Germanic world's approach to freedom. The revolution successfully destroys the arbitrary privileges and irrational institutions of the old regime, establishing the principle that political authority must be based on rational consent rather than traditional authority. But the revolution also demonstrates the destructive potential of abstract universal principles when they are not mediated through concrete institutions and ethical relationships. The terror reveals what happens when revolutionary enthusiasm tries to create perfect freedom through the immediate application of rational principles without regard for existing social bonds and cultural traditions. Hegel sees the constitutional monarchy of his own time as the synthesis that preserves the revolutionary commitment to universal freedom while avoiding the destructive abstractness of radical democracy. Constitutional monarchy combines popular participation with institutional stability, individual rights with social solidarity, rational principles with historical tradition. The monarch serves as the symbolic unity of the state, while elected representatives provide democratic legitimacy and professional civil servants ensure competent administration. This system enables citizens to participate in rational political life without requiring them to transcend all particular attachments and cultural identities. But Hegel's philosophy of history extends beyond political development to encompass all forms of cultural achievement. Art, religion, science and philosophy also exhibit historical development that follows comprehensible, rational patterns. Each cultural form achieves its highest expression in particular historical periods that provide the appropriate conditions for its development. Greek art, Christian religion and German philosophy represent the culminating achievements of their respective cultural spheres. This does not mean that later periods are simply inferior, but that different cultural forms achieve their peak realization under different historical conditions. The task of philosophical analysis is to understand how each period contributes to the overall development of human self-consciousness and freedom. Part 10. The Beautiful, the Holy, and the True. At the summit of Hegel's system stands absolute spirit, the realm in which humanity achieves complete self-understanding through its highest cultural achievements. Absolute spirit encompasses art, religion and philosophy as the three fundamental ways in which human consciousness grasps its own essential nature and its relationship to ultimate reality. Unlike the finite spirits encountered in individual psychology or social and political life, absolute spirit transcends all limitations and achieves genuinely infinite self-knowledge. Each of these three forms represents a different mode of human self-understanding, but all share the common goal of comprehending the ultimate unity of thought and reality, finite and infinite, human and divine. Art represents the first and most immediate form of absolute spirit, where truth appears in sensuous form as beauty. In genuine art, universal spiritual content achieves perfect expression through particular sensuous materials, creating objects that embody meaning rather than merely representing it. A great work of art does not simply illustrate abstract ideas, but makes spiritual reality directly present to perception and feeling. When we encounter authentic artistic beauty, we experience the unity of universal and particular, infinite and finite in immediate intuitive form. Art thus provides the first glimpse of absolute truth, though in a form that remains bound to sensuous representation rather than pure conceptual understanding. Hegel traces the historical development of art through three major stages that correspond to different relationships between spiritual content and sensuous form. Symbolic art, exemplified by Egyptian architecture and sculpture, expresses spiritual content that exceeds its sensuous embodiment. The pyramids and sphinxes point toward infinite mystery and power, but the sensuous forms cannot adequately contain or express their spiritual significance. Classical art, achieving its highest expression in Greek sculpture, creates perfect harmony between spiritual content and sensuous form. The Greek statues of gods and heroes embody ideal human beauty in forms that perfectly express their spiritual significance. But this perfection is also a limitation because it restricts spiritual content to forms that can be adequately represented in sensuous materials. Romantic art transcends these limitations by recognizing that infinite spiritual content cannot be completely contained in any finite sensuous form. Christian painting, medieval architecture and modern poetry express the infinite inwardness of spirit by showing the inadequacy of all external representation. Romantic art achieves greater spiritual depth than classical art, but at the cost of perfect sensuous beauty. The development of romantic art eventually leads to the dissolution of art itself as an adequate mode of absolute truth. Modern art becomes increasingly self-reflective and conceptual, pointing beyond aesthetic experience toward explicitly religious and philosophical forms of understanding. This dissolution does not represent the death of art, but its transformation into higher forms of spiritual expression. Religion represents the second form of absolute spirit, where absolute truth appears in the form of representation and feeling rather than pure sensuous intuition. Religious consciousness grasps the unity of finite and infinite through stories, symbols, and rituals that engage the whole person rather than merely aesthetic contemplation. Religion provides more adequate content than art because it explicitly recognizes the infinite nature of ultimate reality, but it remains limited by its dependence on representational thinking rather than pure conceptual comprehension. Religious truth appears in the form of narratives about divine activity rather than systematic logical development. Hegel traces the development of religion through three stages that parallel the development of art and represent progressively more adequate approaches to infinite reality. Nature religion, exemplified by various forms of pantheism and animism, recognizes divine presence in natural phenomena, but cannot distinguish adequately between finite and infinite. Religions of spiritual individuality, including Judaism, Greek polytheism, and Roman imperial cults, recognize divine transcendence but maintain external relationships between human and divine. Absolute religion, achieved uniquely in Christianity, recognizes the complete unity of human and divine through the doctrine of incarnation. Christianity represents the highest achievement of religious consciousness because it grasps the fundamental truth that infinite spirit realizes itself through finite spiritual existence. The doctrine of incarnation reveals that God becomes human in order that humans might become divine, not through external transformation, but through recognition of their essential spiritual nature. The death and resurrection of Christ represents the overcoming of the separation between finite and infinite, the recognition that infinite life is achieved through the negation of mere finitude. The Holy Spirit represents the presence of infinite spirit within the community of believers who recognize their unity with divine life. But even Christianity, as the highest form of religious consciousness, remains limited by its dependence on representational thinking and emotional conviction rather than pure rational insight. Religious truth appears in the form of stories and doctrines that must be believed rather than demonstrated, symbols that point toward truth rather than expressing it directly. This limitation points beyond religion toward philosophy as the highest and most adequate form of absolute spirit. Philosophy achieves the same truth as religion, but in the form of pure conceptual thinking rather than representational belief. Philosophy represents the culmination of absolute spirit and of Hegel's entire systematic development. In philosophy, absolute truth achieves complete self-transparency through purely conceptual thinking that requires no external support from sensation, representation, or authority. Philosophical thinking is genuinely infinite because it comprehends its own activity as the source of all the categories and distinctions it employs. The philosopher does not discover truth in some external realm, but recognizes that rational thinking itself is the ultimate reality of which all finite existence is a manifestation. This recognition completes the circle of Hegel's system by showing that the logical categories with which the system began are not arbitrary constructions, but the essential structure of reality itself. Philosophy thus achieves absolute knowledge, thinking that knows itself as both the subject and object of its own activity. Part 11. The Drama of Recognition. The concept of recognition stands at the very heart of Hegel's understanding of human nature and social life. Recognition is not simply a psychological need for approval or validation, but the fundamental structure through which human beings achieve self-consciousness and genuine freedom. We cannot know who we are as individuals without acknowledgement from others who are capable of meaningful recognition, and we cannot achieve authentic selfhood through solitary introspection or individual achievement. Recognition creates the intersubjective foundation for all higher forms of human development, from personal identity through social institutions to cultural achievements. The struggle for recognition begins with the most basic fact about human consciousness, that it is essentially self-related. Unlike animals that are simply conscious of their environment, human beings are self-conscious, aware of themselves as the subjects of their own experience. But this self-awareness creates an immediate problem because the self cannot validate its own claims about its nature and worth. If I assert that I am rational, free, or deserving of respect, this assertion remains merely subjective unless it receives acknowledgement from others who are themselves rational and capable of making similar claims. Self-consciousness thus drives beyond itself toward recognition from other self-conscious beings. But recognition cannot be extracted by force or manipulation because its value depends precisely on its being freely given by someone who has the power to withhold it. Genuine recognition must come from others who are themselves free and rational, not from those who are coerced or incapable of meaningful judgment. This creates the fundamental paradox of recognition. We need acknowledgement from others to validate our freedom, but this acknowledgement is only valuable if it comes from others who are equally free. The struggle for recognition thus becomes a struggle to create the conditions under which mutual recognition becomes possible. The master-slave dialectic represents the most primitive and ultimately self-defeating attempt to solve this problem. Each consciousness tries to force the other to acknowledge its superiority through a life and death struggle that demonstrates its willingness to risk everything for recognition. But the master's victory undermines the very recognition he sought, because a slave who is forced to acknowledge superiority provides no genuine validation. The master receives only empty formal recognition from someone he regards as inferior, while the slave's acknowledgement becomes meaningless precisely because it is coerced. This reveals that recognition cannot be achieved through domination, but requires relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocity. The failure of the master-slave relationship drives consciousness toward more adequate forms of recognition that transcend domination and subordination. Stoicism represents the first attempt to achieve recognition through withdrawal from external relationships and dependence on inner rational conviction. The Stoic achieves a form of independence by becoming indifferent to external circumstances and finding freedom in rational acceptance of necessity. But Stoic freedom remains abstract and negative, achieved through withdrawal from engagement rather than active transformation of conditions. The Stoic can maintain inner dignity but cannot create the external conditions needed for genuine human flourishing. Skepticism pushes the Stoic withdrawal to its logical extreme by doubting the validity of all claims about external reality. The skeptic achieves perfect independence by refusing to commit to any particular beliefs or values that could be challenged or refuted. But skeptical freedom proves to be self-undermining because it cannot provide any positive content for human existence. The skeptic maintains freedom from error by avoiding all definite commitments, but this leaves consciousness empty and unable to engage meaningfully with reality. Skeptical consciousness becomes what Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness, torn between its desire for certainty and its inability to find any reliable foundation for belief. The unhappy consciousness represents a crucial stage in the development of self-understanding because it reveals the inadequacy of purely individual approaches to the problem of recognition. The unhappy consciousness experiences itself as divided between its finite, changing particular existence and its aspiration toward infinite, unchanging, universal truth. It projects its own infinite aspirations onto a transcendent realm that remains forever beyond its reach, creating the characteristic structure of medieval Christianity with its separation between earthly and heavenly existence. This division generates endless longing and self-denial as consciousness tries to overcome its finite limitations through ascetic practices and mystical experiences. But the unhappy consciousness eventually recognizes that its search for infinite recognition cannot be satisfied through individual spiritual exercises. The infinite that it seeks is not located in some transcendent realm beyond human experience, but is present within human relationships and cultural achievements. This recognition drives consciousness beyond individual spirituality toward participation in shared practices and institutions that embody collective human achievements. Recognition becomes possible not through escape from finite existence, but through the creation of finite institutions that adequately express infinite human capacities. The movement beyond the unhappy consciousness leads to reason, where consciousness recognizes that it can find itself reflected in the objective structures of reality. Rational consciousness discovers that the categories it uses to think about reality are not merely subjective impositions, but correspond to the actual structure of objective existence. This creates the possibility for genuine knowledge that is neither merely subjective opinion nor external authority, but the unity of subjective thinking and objective reality. Reason provides the foundation for scientific understanding, moral judgment, and cultural creativity by showing how human consciousness can achieve objective validity through its own rational activity. But even rational consciousness remains incomplete as long as it exists as individual reason, seeking recognition from other individual rational beings. The full realization of recognition requires the creation of institutions and practices that embody the mutual acknowledgement of rational freedom in concrete social forms. This is the realm of spirit, where recognition becomes institutionalized through family relationships, civil society, political participation, and cultural achievements. Recognition thus provides the key to understanding Hegel's entire social and political philosophy as an account of how human beings create the conditions for mutual acknowledgement and collective self-realization. Part 12. The Kantian Revolution and its Limits. Hegel's philosophical development cannot be understood without grasping his complex relationship to Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who created the framework within which all subsequent German philosophy developed. Kant's critical philosophy represents both the highest achievement of Enlightenment thinking and the starting point for the idealist movement that culminates in Hegel's system. Hegel sees himself as completing the Kantian revolution by overcoming the dualisms and limitations that prevent Kant from achieving genuine systematic knowledge. Understanding Hegel's critique of Kant reveals the motivation behind his own philosophical project and the distinctive character of his idealist approach. Kant's Copernican revolution transforms philosophy by arguing that objects must conform to our knowledge rather than our knowledge conforming to objects. Traditional empiricism and rationalism both assume that the mind must somehow mirror or copy an independent external reality, creating insurmountable problems about how finite minds can achieve reliable knowledge of infinite reality. Kant solves this problem by arguing that we can only know objects as they appear to us through the forms of intuition and categories of understanding that structure all possible experience. Space, time, causality and substance are not features of things in themselves, but necessary structures of human cognition that make experience possible. This revolutionary insight enables Kant to secure the possibility of genuine knowledge, while limiting its scope to the realm of phenomena. We can have certain knowledge about the natural world because natural objects are constituted through the same cognitive structures that we use to think about them. Scientific knowledge achieves objectivity not by copying external reality, but by applying universal cognitive categories to sensory experience. But this solution comes at the cost of making things in themselves unknowable, creating a fundamental dualism between the phenomenal world we can know and the noumenal world that remains forever beyond our cognitive reach. Hegel admires Kant's insight that knowledge involves the active contribution of cognitive structures rather than passive reception of external impressions. But he argues that Kant does not push this insight far enough and remains trapped within assumptions that undermine his own revolutionary discovery. The dualism between phenomena and noumena, appearances and things in themselves, creates more problems than it solves. If things in themselves are completely unknowable, how can we even know that they exist or that they cause our sensory experience? The very concept of an unknowable reality that affects us seems to violate Kant's own critical principles by making claims about what lies beyond possible experience. More fundamentally, Hegel argues that Kant's approach treats the categories of understanding as merely subjective forms that we impose on external content rather than recognizing them as the objective structure of reality itself. This creates an artificial separation between form and content, subject and object, that prevents genuine systematic knowledge. If the categories are merely our ways of organizing experience rather than features of reality itself, then knowledge remains subjective and cannot claim genuine objectivity. Kant saves the phenomena by sacrificing the noumena, but this division makes both sides abstract and one-sided. Hegel's solution is to eliminate the thing in itself entirely and recognize that reality is thoroughly conceptual in character. The categories are not subjective forms imposed on external content, but the objective logical structure through which reality constitutes itself. Thought and being are identical, not because reality is reduced to subjective thinking, but because both thinking and being are expressions of the same logical development. This enables Hegel to preserve Kant's insight about the active character of knowledge while avoiding the dualisms that limit Kantian philosophy. Kant's moral philosophy reveals similar limitations despite its profound insights about the nature of ethical obligation. The categorical imperative correctly identifies the formal structure of moral thinking by demanding universal principles that respect the rational autonomy of all persons. But Kant's emphasis on formal universality leaves moral philosophy without determinate content. The categorical imperative tells us to avoid contradiction and treat persons as ends in themselves. But it cannot specify what particular duties we have or how we should organize social and political life. Kant's moral philosophy remains at the level of abstract universal principles that cannot guide concrete ethical decision-making. Moreover, Kant's sharp separation between duty and inclination, moral obligation and natural desire, creates an artificial opposition that makes moral life appear as constant struggle against our natural impulses. This dualistic approach fails to recognize that genuine moral development involves the transformation of our desires rather than their simple suppression. Ethical life should integrate rational principles with emotional commitment, creating forms of life where duty and inclination support rather than oppose each other. Kant's moral philosophy points toward this integration, but cannot achieve it because of its commitment to formal universality and abstract individual autonomy. Hegel's approach to these problems involves showing how Kantian insights can be preserved and developed within a more systematic framework that overcomes critical limitations. The categories of understanding become moments in the logical development of the concept itself rather than subjective forms applied to external content. Moral principles achieve determinate content through embodiment in concrete social institutions rather than remaining at the level of formal universality. The opposition between freedom and nature is overcome through recognition that natural development culminates in spiritual freedom rather than being simply external to it. But Hegel's critique of Kant also involves deep appreciation for the critical philosophy's revolutionary achievements. Kant's recognition of the spontaneity of cognition, the autonomy of moral agents, and the systematic character of philosophical knowledge provide essential foundations for Hegel's own systematic development. The Kantian revolution makes idealism possible by showing that reality must be understood through the structures of rational thought rather than treated as simply external to cognition. Hegel sees himself as fulfilling rather than rejecting the Kantian project by developing its insights to their logical conclusion. Part 13. The Agony of Division. Among all the shapes of consciousness that Hegel analyzes in his phenomenology, none is more poignant or psychologically penetrating than the unhappy consciousness, the form of awareness that experiences itself as fundamentally divided and alienated from its own essence. The unhappy consciousness represents a crucial stage in the development of human self-understanding, one that many people recognize as their own existential condition. It emerges when consciousness can no longer find adequate recognition in external relationships and turns inward seeking validation from an infinite source that always remains beyond its reach. This creates the characteristic structure of religious consciousness in its most alienated form, where the human and divine appear as irreconcilably opposed. The unhappy consciousness develops out of the collapse of ancient ethical life, particularly the breakdown of Greek culture's beautiful harmony between individual and community. When social institutions no longer provide adequate recognition for individual self-consciousness, people are thrown back on their own resources and must seek validation through private rather than public means. But individual consciousness cannot validate itself through purely private reflection because self-consciousness requires acknowledgement from others. This creates a desperate search for recognition from a source that transcends all finite limitations, leading to the projection of infinite value onto a transcendent realm that remains forever separated from ordinary human existence. The unhappy consciousness experiences itself as divided between its finite, changing, particular existence and its awareness of infinite, unchanging, universal truth. Everything about its actual existence appears contingent, limited, and unsatisfactory when measured against its infinite aspirations. Its body is subject to disease and death. Its emotions are unstable and conflicted, its thoughts are partial and uncertain, its achievements are temporary and inadequate. Yet it remains convinced that somewhere there exists perfect being, absolute truth, and complete fulfillment that could satisfy its deepest longings. This creates an endless cycle of self-denial and frustrated aspiration as consciousness tries to transcend its finite limitations. Medieval Christianity provides the classic historical example of unhappy consciousness, though Hegel's analysis applies to any form of awareness that experiences irreconcilable division between finite and infinite. The Christian believer experiences God as absolutely perfect and infinitely loving, but precisely because of this perfection, God appears as completely other than sinful, finite human existence. The more perfect God appears, the more inadequate and worthless human existence becomes by comparison. This creates what Hegel calls the painful feeling of separation, where consciousness experiences its own existence as an obstacle to union with the divine rather than as a vehicle for divine realization. The unhappy consciousness seeks to overcome this separation through various forms of ascetic practice and mystical experience. It tries to negate its finite existence through fasting, celibacy, self-denial, and contemplative withdrawal from ordinary social engagement. These practices are meant to purify consciousness of its finite limitations and prepare it for union with the infinite. But every such attempt fails because the very effort to transcend finitude reinforces the separation it seeks to overcome. The more consciousness tries to escape its finite existence, the more aware it becomes of its continued entrapment within finite limitations. Ascetic practices become sources of spiritual pride rather than genuine transcendence. The unhappy consciousness also seeks recognition through devoted service to the infinite, hoping to achieve union through complete self-surrender. It adopts the attitude of the devoted heart that finds meaning and validation through complete submission to divine will. This creates moments of apparent reconciliation, where consciousness experiences itself as accepted and loved, despite its finite limitations. But these moments remain fleeting and unstable because they depend on emotional states rather than genuine insight into the nature of finite and infinite. The devoted heart oscillates between experiences of divine presence and divine absence, creating even greater instability than rational skepticism. The deepest problem with unhappy consciousness is that it treats the infinite as completely external to finite existence rather than recognizing the infinite as the truth of the finite itself. It projects all positive value onto a transcendent realm and treats actual human existence as merely negative, something to be overcome rather than fulfilled. This prevents consciousness from recognizing that its own capacity for infinite aspiration reveals the presence of infinity within finite existence. The very fact that finite consciousness can conceive of and long for the infinite shows that the infinite is not simply external to finite existence, but is its own deepest truth. Hegel's analysis of unhappy consciousness reveals both its necessary role in human development and its ultimate inadequacy as a final form of self-understanding. The unhappy consciousness performs the crucial service of revealing the inadequacy of purely finite forms of recognition and driving consciousness beyond immediate social relationships toward ultimate questions about the nature of existence. It forces consciousness to confront the difference between finite and infinite and prevents it from settling into comfortable but limited forms of social conformity. Without passing through the experience of unhappy consciousness, human beings cannot achieve the depth of self-understanding needed for genuine spiritual maturity. But unhappy consciousness must eventually recognize that its search for infinite recognition cannot be satisfied through withdrawal from finite existence. The infinite it seeks is not located in some transcendent realm beyond human experience, but is present within human relationships and cultural achievements when these are adequately understood. This recognition transforms unhappy consciousness into reason, where consciousness discovers that it can find itself reflected in the objective world rather than seeking validation from an external source. The movement beyond unhappy consciousness represents one of the most crucial transitions in human spiritual development, the recognition that finite existence is the vehicle for infinite realization rather than an obstacle to it. Contemporary forms of unhappy consciousness appear whenever people experience irreconcilable alienation between their actual existence and their idealized self-image. This can take secular as well as religious forms, appearing in romantic idealization of perfect love, utopian political movements that demand immediate transformation, or philosophical systems that treat finite existence as merely apparent. Understanding Hegel's analysis of unhappy consciousness provides insight into these contemporary forms of alienation and points toward more adequate approaches to the relationship between finite and infinite, actual and ideal. Part 14. The World of Needs and Work. Civil society represents one of Hegel's most prescient and influential contributions to social and political theory. His analysis of the realm of economic relationships and voluntary associations that emerges between the family and the state. This sphere encompasses what we now call market economics, professional organizations, social classes, and the entire network of institutions through which individuals pursue their particular interests while remaining connected to larger social wholes. Hegel's analysis anticipates many of the insights that Karl Marx would later develop about capitalist society, while also providing a more balanced assessment of both the benefits and dangers of modern economic life. Understanding civil society is crucial for grasping Hegel's approach to the relationship between individual freedom and social solidarity. Civil society emerges when individuals leave the natural unity of the family and begin to pursue their particular interests through relationships with strangers who share no immediate bonds of affection or kinship. This represents a crucial stage in the development of human freedom because it enables individuals to develop their particular talents and pursue their specific goals rather than remaining confined to traditional family roles. In civil society, people relate to each other primarily as producers and consumers, employers and employees, buyers and sellers, rather than as family members with predetermined obligations and expectations. This creates unprecedented opportunities for individual development and social cooperation based on voluntary agreement rather than natural affection or political authority. But civil society also creates new forms of dependence and conflict that threaten to undermine the very freedom it makes possible. When individuals pursue their private interests without regard for the common good, their activities can produce outcomes that serve no one's interests and create conditions that make individual success impossible. Economic competition can lead to exploitation, inequality and social fragmentation, while the pursuit of profit can override considerations of human welfare and environmental sustainability. Civil society thus exhibits what Hegel calls a dialectical character, where the pursuit of individual freedom creates conditions that threaten freedom itself. Hegel identifies three main aspects of civil society that correspond to different dimensions of economic and social life. The system of needs encompasses all the economic relationships through which individuals satisfy their material requirements through cooperation with others who have different skills and resources. This includes production, distribution, consumption and exchange, the entire network of economic activity that enables complex societies to sustain themselves. The administration of justice provides the legal framework that regulates economic relationships and protects individual rights while ensuring that private pursuits remain compatible with social cooperation. The police and the corporation represent two different approaches to managing the social problems that arise from economic activity and ensuring that civil society serves human welfare rather than undermining it. The system of needs reveals both the remarkable achievements and the serious limitations of market relationships as a foundation for social cooperation. Through the division of labour and voluntary exchange, civil society enables individuals with diverse talents and interests to coordinate their activities in ways that serve everyone's needs more effectively than isolated self-sufficiency. A complex market economy can produce and distribute goods and services on a scale and with an efficiency that would be impossible through centralized planning or traditional community cooperation. Moreover, market relationships respect individual freedom by allowing people to choose their occupations, their associates, and their consumption patterns, rather than having these determined by traditional authority or political decree. But the system of needs also generates inequalities and instabilities that threaten to undermine its own foundations. Some individuals accumulate wealth, while others fall into poverty, not necessarily because of differences in effort or merit, but because of factors beyond their control, market fluctuations, technological changes, or inherited disadvantages. These inequalities can become self-reinforcing as wealth provides access to education, social connections and investment opportunities that are denied to those without resources. Moreover, the system of needs is subject to cyclical crises where overproduction, underconsumption, or financial speculation can destroy the prosperity of entire communities and throw willing workers into involuntary unemployment. Hegel recognizes that these problems cannot be solved simply through individual virtue or market mechanisms alone, but require institutional interventions that modify the operation of economic relationships. The administration of justice provides the legal framework that defines and protects property rights, enforces contracts, and punishes fraud and theft. But legal institutions alone cannot address the broader social problems that arise from economic inequality and instability. This requires what Hegel calls the police, not just law enforcement in the narrow sense, but the entire range of public policies that regulate economic activity to serve the common good. Police power includes economic regulation, social welfare provision, public education, and environmental protection, all the ways that political authority intervenes in civil society to ensure that private pursuits serve public purposes. The corporation represents Hegel's most innovative contribution to thinking about civil society, his analysis of the voluntary associations through which individuals with shared occupational interests organize to protect their common welfare. Corporations in Hegel's sense are not business enterprises but professional guilds, trade associations and other organizations that bring together people who work in similar fields. These associations provide social recognition, mutual support, and collective representation that pure market relationships cannot supply. They enable individuals to achieve a form of social identity and belonging that transcends purely private family relationships, without requiring the universality of full political citizenship. Hegel's analysis of civil society reveals why purely economic relationships cannot provide an adequate foundation for human flourishing, even when they operate efficiently and fairly. Market relationships treat people primarily as means for satisfying each other's needs, rather than recognizing them as ends in themselves, deserving of respect and recognition. This instrumental approach to human relationships serves important functions, but cannot satisfy the deeper human need for acknowledgement and community. Civil society thus points beyond itself toward the state as the institution that can provide universal recognition while preserving the benefits of individual freedom and social diversity that civil society makes possible. Part 15. The Specter of Materialism. No philosopher has exercised greater influence on subsequent social and political thought than Karl Marx, and no philosophical relationship is more complex and contested than the connection between Marx's historical materialism and Hegel's idealist dialectic. Marx famously claimed that he found Hegel's dialectic standing on its head and turned it right side up, replacing the movement of ideas with the development of material productive forces as the motor of historical change. But Marx also acknowledged his enormous debt to Hegel and described his own method as the rational kernel extracted from the mystical shell of Hegelian philosophy. Understanding this relationship reveals both the continuing influence of Hegelian insights and the fundamental differences between idealist and materialist approaches to social analysis. Marx's intellectual development begins with engagement with Hegel's political philosophy and philosophy of history, particularly the account of alienation and the struggle for recognition. The young Marx accepts Hegel's insight that human beings achieve self-realization through creative activity that transforms the external world according to rational purposes. But Marx argues that Hegel remains trapped within abstract philosophical speculation and fails to analyze the concrete material conditions that actually determine human development. Real human beings do not live primarily in the realm of ideas, but must first satisfy their basic material needs through productive labor before they can engage in higher forms of cultural activity. This shift from idealist to materialist premises leads Marx to fundamentally reinterpret Hegelian concepts while preserving their dialectical structure. Marx's analysis of alienated labor directly parallels Hegel's account of the master-slave relationship, but locates the source of alienation in economic rather than purely conceptual relationships. Under capitalist production, workers become separated from the products of their labor, from the activity of production itself, from their own human essence, and from their fellow workers. This alienation is not merely a matter of consciousness, but is rooted in the objective structure of capitalist property relations, where workers must sell their labor power to capitalists who own the means of production. The worker experiences the same reversal that Hegel describes in the master-slave dialectic, creating wealth and power through their labor while becoming increasingly impoverished and powerless themselves. But Marx argues that Hegel's analysis remains abstract and philosophical because it treats alienation as a problem of consciousness rather than recognizing its material foundations. Hegel's slave achieves freedom through the recognition that he has created the world through his labor. But this recognition alone cannot change the objective conditions of domination and exploitation. Real freedom requires not just intellectual insight, but material transformation of the productive relationships that create alienation in the first place. This leads Marx to emphasize revolutionary practice rather than philosophical comprehension as the key to human liberation. Marx's materialist interpretation of history preserves the dialectical structure of Hegel's philosophy of history while replacing the development of consciousness with the development of productive forces. Historical change occurs through contradictions between the forces of production, the technical and organizational capacity for creating wealth, and the relations of production. The social relationships that determine who controls productive resources and receives the benefits of productive activity. When productive forces develop to the point where existing social relations become obstacles to further development, revolutionary change becomes necessary to establish new social relationships that can accommodate higher levels of productive capacity. This dialectical process drives historical development from primitive communism through slavery, feudalism and capitalism toward the eventual achievement of socialist and communist society. Marx's analysis of capitalism employs Hegelian dialectical methods to reveal the internal contradictions that will eventually lead to capitalism's overthrow. Capitalism creates the conditions for its own destruction by concentrating workers in large industrial enterprises where they can recognize their common interests and organize for collective action. The competitive drive for profit leads to technological innovation that increases productivity, but also creates unemployment and reduces the rate of profit, generating economic crises that reveal the irrationality of production for profit rather than human need. Most fundamentally, capitalism creates a proletariat that has nothing to lose but its chains and everything to gain from revolutionary transformation of the entire social system. But Marx's relationship to Hegel involves not only appropriation but also fundamental criticism of idealist premises and methods. Marx argues that Hegel's absolute spirit is actually an ideological reflection of existing social relationships rather than their ultimate truth, a way of reconciling people to unjust conditions by convincing them that these conditions express rational necessity. Hegelian philosophy serves the interests of the ruling class by providing intellectual justification for existing institutions and discouraging practical efforts to change them. The owl of Minerva that spreads its wings only at dusk represents philosophy's inherently conservative character, its ability to comprehend historical developments only after they have become obsolete. Marx also criticizes Hegel's method for remaining within the sphere of abstract thinking, rather than engaging with concrete material reality. Hegelian dialectic operates through purely conceptual development, where contradictions are resolved through intellectual synthesis rather than practical struggle. This leads to false reconciliation, where real conflicts are overcome in thought while remaining unresolved in actual social relationships. Marx argues that genuine dialectical method must involve material practice that actually transforms social relationships rather than merely comprehending them philosophically. The point is not to interpret the world, but to change it, and this requires moving beyond philosophical speculation to revolutionary political activity. Despite these fundamental criticisms, Marx continues to employ recognizably Hegelian concepts and methods throughout his mature economic analysis. The dialectical development of capitalism that Marx traces in Capital follows the same pattern of contradiction and resolution that structures Hegel's logic, though applied to material rather than purely conceptual relationships. Marx's analysis of commodity fetishism parallels Hegel's account of consciousness, mistaking its own products for independent external realities. The revolutionary transformation that Marx envisions will overcome alienation and create conditions for genuine human self-realization, echoes Hegelian themes about recognition and freedom, though grounded in material rather than spiritual foundations. The relationship between Hegel and Marx continues to influence contemporary social theory and political practice. Liberation movements, critical theorists, and radical philosophers continue to draw on both Hegelian and Marxist insights while debating the relationship between material and cultural factors in social change. Understanding this relationship provides crucial insight into the ongoing relevance of dialectical thinking for analyzing contemporary social problems and imagining alternatives to existing institutional arrangements. Part 16. The Twilight of Beauty. Among Hegel's most provocative and influential claims is his thesis that art, in its highest vocation, is and remains for us a thing of the past. This does not mean that people will stop creating or appreciating aesthetic objects, but that art can no longer serve its ancient function as the primary vehicle through which cultures express their deepest truths about reality and human existence. In the modern world, art has been superseded by religion and philosophy as the highest forms of cultural expression, leaving aesthetic creation in a condition of fundamental uncertainty about its purpose and direction. Understanding this thesis requires grasping Hegel's account of the historical development of art and its relationship to the broader development of human consciousness and cultural life. Hegel's philosophy of art is grounded in his conviction that genuine art serves as a form of truth revelation, rather than mere entertainment or decoration. Authentic artistic creation makes spiritual content sensibly present, allowing universal truths about human existence to be grasped through particular sensuous forms. When we encounter great art, we do not simply enjoy beautiful objects, but gain insight into the deepest structures of reality and human experience. Art at its highest achieves what Hegel calls the sensuous appearance of the idea, the presentation of infinite spiritual content through finite material forms. This truth-revealing function distinguishes genuine art from mere craft, entertainment, or aesthetic pleasure, though these remain legitimate aspects of artistic activity. The historical development of art passes through three major stages that correspond to different relationships between spiritual content and sensuous form. Symbolic art, exemplified by Egyptian pyramids, sphinxes, and colossal architecture, attempts to express infinite spiritual content that exceeds the capacity of any finite sensuous form. These works create powerful impressions of mystery and sublimity, but cannot achieve adequate expression of their spiritual significance because the content they seek to express transcends all sensuous representation. Symbolic art points beyond itself toward meanings that cannot be fully contained within aesthetic form, creating the characteristic tension between finite form and infinite content. Classical art, achieving its highest expression in Greek sculpture, creates perfect harmony between spiritual content and sensuous form. The Greek statues of gods and heroes embody ideal human beauty in forms that perfectly express their spiritual significance without remainder or inadequacy. Classical art achieves what symbolic art could only aspire toward: the complete unity of infinite meaning and finite appearance. But this achievement is also a limitation because it restricts spiritual content to what can be adequately expressed through sensuous beauty. Classical art can represent the divine only insofar as divine content can be embodied in idealized human form, excluding aspects of spiritual life that transcend such representation. Romantic art transcends the limitations of classical art by recognizing that infinite spiritual content cannot be completely contained within any finite sensuous form. Christian painting, medieval architecture, and modern poetry express the infinite inwardness of spirit by demonstrating the inadequacy of all external representation. Romantic art achieves greater spiritual depth than classical art because it can represent the movement of inner life, the struggles of conscience, the complexities of emotional experience, and the relationship between finite and infinite. But romantic art purchases this spiritual depth at the cost of sensuous beauty and formal perfection. As art becomes more spiritually adequate, it becomes less purely aesthetic, pointing beyond aesthetic experience toward explicitly religious and philosophical forms of understanding. The development of romantic art leads inevitably to what Hegel calls the dissolution of art, the condition where aesthetic creation becomes increasingly self-reflective and loses confidence in its ability to express ultimate truth. Modern art becomes preoccupied with formal experimentation, ironic commentary, and questioning of its own foundations, rather than straightforward expression of spiritual content. Artists become self-conscious about the history and limitations of their medium, creating works that comment on previous artistic traditions rather than naively expressing contemporary spiritual life. This self-reflexivity enables sophisticated aesthetic achievements, but also reveals art's loss of its original truth-revealing function. The end-of-art thesis does not imply that aesthetic creation will cease or that modern art lacks value, but that art can no longer serve as the primary vehicle for cultural self-understanding. In ancient cultures, artistic creations provided the main form through which communities expressed and transmitted their deepest beliefs about reality, human nature, and the meaning of existence. Greek tragedy, medieval cathedral architecture, and Renaissance painting served functions that we now associate primarily with philosophy, science, and religion. Modern cultures have developed specialized institutions for pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness separately rather than seeking their unity through aesthetic experience. This specialization enables higher levels of achievement within each domain, but also creates problems of cultural fragmentation and alienation. When truth becomes the province of science, goodness the concern of moral philosophy, and beauty the realm of aesthetic theory, ordinary people may find it difficult to integrate these aspects of experience into coherent forms of life. The loss of art's integrative function contributes to what many observers describe as the spiritual crisis of modernity, the difficulty of finding overarching meaning and purpose in increasingly specialized and rationalized societies. Hegel's analysis anticipates many contemporary concerns about the relationship between aesthetic, scientific, and moral forms of understanding. But Hegel's thesis about the end of art also contains an implicit promise about the future of human cultural development. The supersession of art by religion and philosophy represents progress toward more adequate forms of spiritual self-understanding rather than simple cultural decline. Philosophy can achieve the same truths that art expresses, but in more systematic and rationally defensible forms that are accessible to critical examination and development. The end of art as absolute cultural authority creates space for new forms of aesthetic experience that need not bear the burden of providing ultimate truth, but can explore the full range of human experience with unprecedented freedom. Contemporary debates about the status of art in democratic societies, the relationship between aesthetic and political values, and the role of cultural institutions in public life continue to wrestle with issues that Hegel's analysis illuminates. Whether one accepts his specific claims about art's historical development, his approach provides valuable insight into the complex relationships between aesthetic experience, cultural meaning, and social change. Part 17. The Realm of Sensuous Knowing. Hegel's aesthetics represents one of the most comprehensive and systematic attempts in the history of philosophy to understand the nature of artistic beauty and its relationship to truth, morality and spiritual development. Unlike approaches that treat art as mere subjective expression or decorative addition to practical life, Hegel argues that aesthetic experience provides genuine knowledge of reality through sensuous rather than conceptual means. Beautiful objects are not simply pleasing to contemplate, but revelatory of the deepest structures of existence, making spiritual content available to perception and feeling in ways that complement and enrich purely intellectual understanding. This approach enables Hegel to develop detailed analyses of specific art forms while maintaining systematic connections to his broader philosophical concerns. The foundation of Hegel's aesthetics is his conception of beauty as the sensuous appearance of the idea, the presentation of spiritual truth through material forms that make abstract concepts concrete and accessible to immediate experience. Genuine artistic beauty is not mere formal arrangement of colours, sounds or shapes according to principles of harmony and proportion, though these technical elements remain important. Rather, artistic beauty emerges when material forms successfully embody spiritual content, when universal meanings achieve adequate particular expression, when infinite truths become present to finite perception. This requires both mastery of technical artistic means and deep understanding of the spiritual content that art seeks to express. Hegel's systematic approach to aesthetics involves analyzing both the general nature of aesthetic experience and the specific characteristics of different artistic media. The general aesthetics examines the concept of beauty, the nature of artistic creation, and the relationship between aesthetic, theoretical and practical approaches to reality. The special aesthetics provides detailed analysis of architecture, sculpture, painting, music and poetry as distinct art forms with their own materials, techniques and expressive possibilities. Each art form has its own historical development and its own relationship to the broader cultural contexts within which it emerges and achieves its characteristic achievements. Architecture represents the most material and least spiritual of the arts because it works primarily with mass, weight and spatial relationship rather than more subtle forms of sensuous presentation. But precisely because of its material character, architecture can express certain aspects of spiritual life that other arts cannot capture, particularly the relationship between human communities and their natural and historical environments. Egyptian pyramids express the massive weight of death and the aspiration toward eternity through their monumental scale and geometric perfection. Greek temples create sacred spaces that embody the harmony between human and divine through mathematical proportions and organic integration with their surroundings. Gothic cathedrals express Christian spirituality's aspiration toward transcendence through vertical emphasis and the dematerialization of stone into light-filled space. Sculpture achieves more adequate expression of spiritual content because it can represent living beings rather than merely creating spaces for human activity. Greek sculpture represents the pinnacle of sculptural achievement because it creates perfect unity between spiritual content and sensuous form through idealized representation of the human body. The Greek gods appear as beautiful human beings who embody divine perfection without losing their sensuous presence and immediate accessibility. But sculpture remains limited to external representation and cannot express the inner movements of consciousness, emotion and spiritual development that characterize more complex forms of spiritual life. Painting transcends sculpture's limitations by representing not only external form, but also inner life through color, light and compositional relationships that can suggest psychological states and spiritual movements. Christian painting achieves its highest expression in works that represent the divine-human relationship through scenes of incarnation, redemption and spiritual transformation. Renaissance masters like Raphael and Leonardo create visual presentations of spiritual content that achieve unprecedented depth and complexity while maintaining sensuous beauty and immediate impact. But painting remains limited to visual representation and cannot achieve the temporal development that characterizes the most adequate forms of spiritual expression. Music transcends the spatial limitations of visual arts by existing in time and expressing the movement of inner life through temporal development rather than static representation. Musical forms can represent emotional and spiritual processes rather than merely depicting external objects or fixed states of consciousness. Music achieves direct access to subjectivity by creating temporal patterns that parallel the rhythms of inner experience without requiring representational content. But music's freedom from representational constraint is also a limitation because it cannot achieve the determinate content that characterizes the most adequate forms of spiritual expression. Poetry represents the highest form of artistic expression because it combines music's temporal character with determinate conceptual content through the use of language. Poetic language can express the full range of human experience while maintaining the sensuous immediacy that distinguishes artistic from purely conceptual presentation. Epic poetry represents external action and its spiritual significance. Lyric poetry expresses inner subjectivity and its emotional development, and dramatic poetry presents the concrete interaction between subjective purposes and objective circumstances. But poetry's reliance on language brings it close to conceptual thinking and points beyond aesthetic experience toward explicitly philosophical forms of understanding. Hegel's analysis of specific art forms reveals both their distinctive achievements and their systematic relationships within the broader development of human cultural life. Each art form realizes certain possibilities for aesthetic expression while pointing beyond its limitations toward more adequate forms of spiritual presentation. The historical development of the arts follows the same dialectical pattern found throughout Hegel's system, moving from immediate material expression through increasingly adequate spiritual content toward forms of understanding that transcend purely aesthetic representation. But this development does not involve simple rejection of earlier achievements, but their preservation within more comprehensive forms of cultural expression. Contemporary aesthetic theory continues to wrestle with many of the issues that Hegel's systematic approach illuminates, including the relationship between form and content, the connection between aesthetic and cognitive values, and the role of art in democratic societies. Whether one accepts Hegel's specific claims about the historical development of art forms, his systematic approach provides valuable resources for understanding the complex relationships between aesthetic experience, cultural meaning, and human spiritual development. Part 18. The Experience of Estrangement. The concept of alienation stands as one of Hegel's most influential and enduring contributions to understanding the human condition, though its full significance emerges only when understood within the systematic context of his philosophy of consciousness and social development. Alienation is not simply a psychological feeling of dissatisfaction or social criticism of unjust institutions, but a necessary stage in the development of human self-consciousness and freedom. Through alienation, consciousness discovers the inadequacy of immediate relationships and drives beyond itself towards more adequate forms of recognition and self-realization. Understanding Hegel's treatment of alienation reveals both its negative aspects as a form of suffering and its positive function as a vehicle for human development. Alienation emerges whenever consciousness encounters its own products or expressions as foreign powers that appear to control it rather than expressing its freedom. This can occur in multiple dimensions of human experience in relationship to natural objects, social institutions, cultural achievements, and even one's own mental processes. What all forms of alienation share is the experience of externality, where something that actually expresses human activity appears as an independent force that constrains or opposes human purposes. The alienated person feels controlled by forces beyond their understanding or influence, even when these forces are actually products of human activity that could potentially be brought under conscious direction. The most basic form of alienation occurs in consciousness's relationship to the natural world, where objects appear as simply given rather than as mediated through human conceptual activity. Ordinary consciousness treats the external world as completely independent of its own cognitive contribution, failing to recognize that objectivity itself is constituted through subjective thinking. This creates the characteristic stance of naive realism, where consciousness sees itself as passively receiving impressions from an external world that exists independently of all human activity. Such consciousness remains alienated from its own power of world constitution and cannot achieve genuine knowledge of either itself or its objects. Social alienation occurs when human institutions and practices appear as external constraints rather than expressions of collective human freedom. Legal systems, economic relationships, political structures and cultural traditions come to be experienced as foreign impositions that limit human possibilities rather than vehicles through which people achieve mutual recognition and self-realization. This form of alienation is particularly acute in modern societies where complex institutional arrangements often obscure their dependence on human activity and consent. People experience themselves as subject to impersonal forces, market mechanisms, bureaucratic procedures, and technological systems that seem to operate according to their own logic rather than serving human purposes. Religious alienation represents a particularly important form because it involves the projection of human capacities and aspirations onto transcendent beings that appear to possess the perfection that humans lack. The religious consciousness attributes infinite power, knowledge, and goodness to divine beings while experiencing itself as finite, ignorant, and sinful. This creates what Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness, torn between its awareness of infinite value and its experience of finite limitation. Religious alienation serves the positive function of preserving the idea of infinite human potential, but it does so in a form that makes this potential appear as belonging to someone else, rather than constituting the truth of human nature itself. Cultural alienation occurs when human intellectual and artistic achievements appear as monuments to past greatness, rather than living expressions of continuing human creativity. This is particularly problematic in modern societies, where rapid change can make cultural traditions seem obsolete, while new forms of expression have not yet achieved stable recognition. People may feel cut off from their cultural heritage without having developed adequate contemporary forms of cultural participation. Educational institutions often contribute to this alienation by presenting cultural achievements as objects for passive consumption rather than encouraging active participation in ongoing cultural creation. Philosophical alienation emerges when thinking becomes separated from living experience and creates abstract systems that bear no clear relationship to actual human concerns. This can occur in various forms. from rationalist philosophies that treat reality as purely conceptual to empiricist approaches that reduce human experience to sensory data and mechanical associations. Philosophical alienation is overcome only when thinking recognizes itself as a living human activity that emerges from and returns to concrete human experience. This requires philosophy that is both rigorously systematic and genuinely existential, capable of conceptual precision without losing connection to the lived experience from which philosophical problems arise. But Hegel's analysis reveals that alienation serves crucial positive functions in human development and cannot be simply avoided or immediately overcome. Alienation forces consciousness to confront the inadequacy of immediate relationships and drives it toward more adequate forms of self-understanding and social organization. Without experiencing alienation from family, community, tradition and immediate social roles, individuals cannot develop the critical distance needed for genuine moral reflection and autonomous choice. Similarly, without experiencing alienation from existing social institutions, communities cannot develop the motivation needed for social reform and political progress. The overcoming of alienation does not involve return to pre-alienated immediacy, but achievement of what Hegel calls mediated immediacy, forms of relationship that preserve the gains of alienated reflection while transcending its limitations. This requires institutions and practices that enable people to recognize themselves in their social world while respecting the complexity and differentiation that modern life requires. The goal is not the elimination of all externality and otherness, but the creation of forms of externality that adequately express rather than suppress human freedom. This makes the overcoming of alienation an ongoing historical project rather than a final achievement. Contemporary discussions of alienation in psychology, sociology, political theory, and cultural criticism continue to draw on Hegelian insights while extending them to new contexts and problems. Understanding Hegel's systematic treatment of alienation provides valuable resources for analyzing contemporary forms of estrangement and imagining more adequate forms of human relationship and social organization. Part 19. The Method of Philosophy. Hegel's philosophical method represents one of the most systematic and self-conscious attempts in the history of philosophy to develop a form of thinking that is adequate to the complexity and dynamism of reality itself. Unlike approaches that impose external methods on philosophical subject matter, Hegel argues that genuine philosophical thinking must allow its method to emerge from the content it seeks to understand. The method of philosophy cannot be separated from its results because the process of philosophical thinking is itself part of the reality that philosophy seeks to comprehend. This creates what Hegel calls speculative thinking, a form of rational reflection that is simultaneously descriptive and constitutive of the reality it investigates. Traditional philosophical methods typically assume a separation between the thinking subject and the object to be known, requiring some bridge or correspondence to connect subjective concepts with objective reality. Empiricist methods treat experience as the source of knowledge but struggle to explain how finite sensory experience can yield universal and necessary truths. Rationalist methods treat reason as the source of knowledge but face difficulties explaining how rational concepts apply to the contingent world of natural and historical existence. Kantian critical philosophy attempts to overcome these limitations by analyzing the conditions that make experience possible. But this creates new problems about the relationship between phenomena and things in themselves. Hegel's speculative method transcends these dualisms by recognizing that thinking and being are not separate realms that must somehow be connected, but are aspects of a single self-differentiating process. Reality is rational not because it conforms to external logical principles, but because rational thinking is the activity through which reality constitutes and comprehends itself. This means that philosophical method cannot be developed independently of philosophical content, because the method of rational thinking is itself the deepest content of philosophy. Genuine philosophical thinking thinks about thinking itself not as a separate psychological or logical activity, but as the fundamental structure of reality as such. Speculative thinking operates through what Hegel calls determinate negation rather than abstract negation. Abstract negation simply rejects false views without developing positive insights from the process of refutation, leading to skeptical conclusions that deny the possibility of genuine knowledge. Determinate negation recognizes that every false view contains partial truth that must be preserved, while its limitations are overcome through more adequate understanding. This creates a developmental process where each stage of thinking emerges necessarily from the contradictions inherent in previous stages, while preserving their valid insights within more comprehensive frameworks. The dialectical character of speculative thinking means that philosophical development cannot proceed through simple, linear progression, but must involve circular movement that returns to its starting point with enriched understanding. Each philosophical concept or category contains contradictions that drive thinking forward to more complex determinations, but these more complex categories eventually reveal their dependence on the simpler categories from which they emerged. This creates systematic development that is simultaneously progressive and circular, moving forward through increasingly adequate determinations while continually returning to and enriching its fundamental principles. The end of philosophical thinking is also its beginning, but the beginning as comprehended rather than merely presupposed. Hegel's systematic approach requires that every philosophical concept receive its meaning and validity through its relationships with all other concepts, rather than having independent definition or foundation. This holistic method means that no single concept can be fully understood in isolation from the systematic whole within which it functions. The truth of any particular philosophical claim depends on its place within the complete system of philosophical knowledge, rather than on its correspondence to some external standard or its self-evidence to immediate consciousness. This makes philosophical understanding inherently systematic and prevents the arbitrary selection of preferred concepts or principles without consideration of their systematic relationships. But Hegel's systematic method does not involve the mechanical application of external logical forms to philosophical content. The system develops organically through the internal contradictions and transitions of the concepts themselves, rather than through the imposition of predetermined structural patterns. Each concept determines its own development by generating the oppositions and resolutions that lead to more adequate conceptual determinations. This means that philosophical thinking must be patient and allow concepts to develop according to their own logic, rather than forcing them into preconceived frameworks or rushing toward desired conclusions. The speculative character of Hegel's method also requires a distinctive approach to language and expression that can capture the dynamic and contradictory character of conceptual development. Ordinary language and traditional logical forms are designed for fixed relationships and static identities, making them inadequate for expressing the fluid and self-transforming character of speculative thinking. Hegelian philosophical language must be capable of expressing identity in difference, the unity of opposites, and the self-movement of concepts without falling into mere paradox or mystical obscurity. This creates distinctive stylistic challenges that contribute to the notorious difficulty of Hegel's philosophical writings. The results of speculative thinking cannot be separated from the process through which they are achieved, because the method is itself the most important philosophical discovery. Learning to think speculatively involves developing new capacities for conceptual analysis and systematic understanding rather than simply acquiring information about philosophical topics. This makes Hegelian philosophy inherently educational and transformative rather than merely informative. The goal is not just to know about reality, but to participate in the rational process through which reality knows itself. Contemporary philosophical methods continue to wrestle with many of the issues that Hegel's speculative approach addresses, including the relationship between method and content, the problem of philosophical system building, and the role of contradiction in rational thinking. Whether one accepts Hegel's specific claims about the nature of speculative thinking, his systematic approach provides valuable resources for understanding the distinctive character of philosophical reflection and its relationship to other forms of rational inquiry. Part 20. The Living Legacy. 2 centuries after Hegel's death, his philosophical influence continues to shape intellectual and political life in ways that would have been impossible to predict from the academic controversies that surrounded his work during his lifetime. Hegelian concepts, methods, and insights have been appropriated, transformed, and criticized by movements as diverse as Marxist revolutionary theory, existentialist philosophy, analytic philosophy of mind, feminist theory, post-colonial studies, and contemporary neuroscience. This remarkable influence reflects not only the systematic scope of Hegel's original achievement, but also the continuing relevance of the fundamental problems he addressed and the resources his philosophy provides for thinking about contemporary issues. Understanding Hegel's living legacy requires recognizing both the direct transmission of his ideas and their indirect influence through thinkers who developed Hegelian insights in new directions. The most immediately visible line of Hegelian influence runs through Karl Marx and the various forms of socialist and communist theory and practice that developed from Marxist foundations. Marx's historical materialism preserves the dialectical structure of Hegelian philosophy of history while grounding it in analysis of material productive relationships rather than the development of consciousness. 20th century revolutionary movements in Russia, China, Cuba, and throughout the developing world drew inspiration from Marxist theories that retained recognizably Hegelian themes about contradiction, alienation, and historical progress toward greater human freedom. Even when these movements departed dramatically from both Hegelian and Marxist theoretical commitments, they continued to employ dialectical methods of social analysis and political strategy. The existentialist tradition represents a more complex and ambivalent relationship to Hegelian philosophy, simultaneously appropriating and rejecting key aspects of his systematic approach. Søren Kierkegaard, often considered the first existentialist philosopher, developed his entire philosophical approach as a reaction against what he saw as the abstract systematicity and false reconciliation of Hegelian philosophy. But Kierkegaard's emphasis on subjective truth, the primacy of existence over essence, and the importance of passionate commitment versus abstract reflection can be understood as radicalizing certain Hegelian insights about the concrete character of spiritual existence. Similarly, 20th-century existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir employed recognizably Hegelian themes about consciousness, recognition and freedom, while rejecting systematic philosophical approaches in favor of more literary and phenomenological methods. Psychoanalytic theory provides another major channel for Hegelian influence, particularly through the work of Jacques Lacan, who explicitly drew on Hegelian concepts to reinterpret Freudian insights about unconscious mental processes. Lacan's reading of the master-slave dialectic as a fundamental structure of human psychological development influenced generations of psychoanalytic theorists and practitioners. The Hegelian themes of recognition, alienation, and the linguistic constitution of subjectivity became central elements in contemporary psychoanalytic approaches to understanding personality development, social relationships, and cultural formation. Even psychoanalytic theorists who reject Lacanian interpretations often employ concepts and methods that can be traced back to Hegelian sources. Contemporary feminist theory has developed sophisticated engagements with Hegelian philosophy that both criticize and appropriate his insights for understanding gender relationships and women's liberation. Simone de Beauvoir's analysis of women as the second sex employs a recognizably Hegelian framework about recognition and otherness, while feminist philosophers like Susan Buck-Morse have argued that the Haitian Revolution influenced Hegel's original formulation of the master-slave dialectic. Contemporary feminist theorists continue to find Hegelian concepts useful for analyzing patriarchal relationships, while also criticizing the masculine bias in his systematic philosophy and his failure to adequately theorize gender differences. This critical appropriation exemplifies the continuing vitality of Hegelian themes in contemporary social and political theory. Post-colonial theory represents another area where Hegelian influence remains strong despite significant critical engagement with the Eurocentric assumptions of his philosophy of history. Frantz Fanon's analysis of the colonial relationship in Black Skin, White Masks employs the master-slave dialectic to understand the psychological dimensions of colonial domination and anti-colonial resistance. Contemporary post-colonial theorists like Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak continue to draw on Hegelian concepts while also criticizing the universalist assumptions that prevent Hegel from adequately recognizing cultural difference and historical particularity. This critical engagement demonstrates both the continuing relevance and the limitations of Hegelian approaches to understanding contemporary global relationships. Even analytic philosophy, which developed largely in opposition to German idealist traditions, has experienced a renewed engagement with Hegelian themes and methods. Philosophers like John McDowell, Robert Brandom and Terry Pinkard have argued that Hegelian insights about the relationship between mind and world, the social character of rationality, and the historical development of conceptual frameworks provide valuable resources for addressing contemporary problems in philosophy of mind, epistemology, and ethics. This Hegelian revival in analytic philosophy suggests that the traditional opposition between continental and analytic approaches may be less fundamental than previously assumed. Contemporary philosophers are discovering that Hegelian systematic methods can complement rather than compete with more recent developments in logic, cognitive science, and philosophy of language. Perhaps most remarkably, Hegelian themes are beginning to appear in contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science research on consciousness, self-awareness, and social cognition. Scientists studying the neural basis of self-consciousness have discovered that self-awareness emerges through social interaction and depends on the capacity to recognize oneself from the perspective of others. This research provides empirical support for Hegelian claims about the intersubjective character of self-consciousness and the role of recognition in human psychological development. While contemporary scientists do not typically draw directly on Hegelian philosophy, their discoveries often confirm insights that Hegel developed through purely conceptual analysis. The continuing influence of Hegelian philosophy reflects not only its historical importance, but also its engagement with perennial human concerns about freedom, recognition, alienation, and the relationship between individual and community. As contemporary societies struggle with issues of cultural diversity, economic inequality, technological change, and environmental crisis, Hegelian concepts provide valuable resources for analysis and reflection. The dialectical method remains relevant for understanding complex social processes that involve contradiction and development over time. The systematic approach offers alternatives to fragmented approaches that treat social, political, economic, and cultural issues as separate problems requiring separate solutions. But Hegel's living legacy also includes recognition of the limitations and dangers of his systematic approach, particularly its tendency toward false reconciliation and premature closure. Contemporary appropriations of Hegelian philosophy typically involve critical engagement that preserves valuable insights while rejecting problematic assumptions about historical progress, cultural superiority, and systematic completeness. This critical appropriation demonstrates the continuing vitality of philosophical traditions that remain open to reinterpretation and development rather than dogmatic repetition of original formulations. Hegel's own understanding of philosophy as its time comprehended in thoughts suggests that each generation must rethink philosophical problems in light of contemporary conditions and challenges. The ultimate test of any philosophical legacy is not the accuracy of its specific claims, but the fruitfulness of its concepts and methods for addressing continuing human concerns. By this standard, Hegelian philosophy has proven remarkably successful in providing resources for understanding and addressing some of the most pressing issues of modern and contemporary life. Whether future generations will continue to find Hegelian approaches useful remains to be seen, but the persistence of his influence through 2 centuries of dramatic historical change suggests that his insights touch something fundamental about the human condition and the nature of rational reflection itself.